change is happening. And you may look back on this time when you have children and grandchildren, and you will be able to say, I not only lived through it, but let me tell you what I was involved in, what I did, because you are going to be players in this, not merely spectators, in whatever happens in this turbulent era. When I was a student in the 60s, we had a similar era, and I lived through that era in the anti-war movement, which actually happened on campuses, and San Francisco State was one of the centers of the anti-war movement, as was Berkeley, as was the universities back in New York where I went to school. And there's a big difference between today in what you have available to you and what we had available to us. Literally, we had no one on our side. The students all over the United States, once the draft became a reality, united as a generation. We had no governors, no mayors, no congresspeople in the early years at least. Later on, we had people like Gene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy, but that came later. And we had marches on Washington, and I participated in the 69 March on Washington, the 70 March on Washington. The first March on Washington by students was in 1967. And it was a spontaneous revolt in universities with no allies. Your situation is really different. You have a lot of allies. You are in the state of California. The governor is your ally. You're in the city of San Francisco. The mayor is your ally. You're in the you're in the state university system. The chancellor is your ally. When we look at your faculty, the communications department, we are your ally. So unlike the 60s where we were rebelling against all the structures, you have a lot of governance and a lot of society that is on your side waiting for you to act and support you in your actions. And so while we can look at the 60s as a parallel time, in a way, you have an advantage in that your civic and political action will have a lot of support. We became politically involved and civically involved because we felt endangered with a war. You have a situation in which there are very vulnerable people here on campus, and that is why we are doing that workshop, because we can be empowered here at San Francisco State. And it's fitting and proper that this workshop is at San Francisco State. As I mentioned, it was the center for protest in the 60s. And today this campus is really in solidarity with the vulnerable, particularly minorities, who may be affected by a change in the federal government regulations that you're all aware of. Now this student center is named for Cesar Chavez, somebody that in my era, I didn't know him personally, but I was affected by him, as was my generation. He was a community leader in the spirit of the 60s and 70s. He made the plight of farm workers, most of whom were Mexican and Mexican Americans, a cause for many Americans, just as Martin Luther King did for the African Americans in that same era. And what they did, each of them, is they reached out to the values and the consciences of Americans who were not Mexican or not African American, and touched us in a way that we became part of their movement. We became one with them, and they were very conscious that they could not do this alone. So for many years, most of you don't know this, we boycotted grapes all over the country. There was a boycott for many years as a sign of solidarity. Now, why would I, a kid from Queens, New York, who knew no Mexicans, knew no Mexican Americans, really didn't know California, why would I take up that cause? Well, Chavez and the farm workers' leadership connected to my values and the values of many of us, not just in the anti-war movement, but as Americans. And he had a simple message. It's never about grapes, it's always about people. And he gave us a simple action: boycott grapes. Important that when you have a movement, a simple message with a simple ask can do wonders. And he empowered us, Cesar Chavez, to empower the farm workers, not by policy papers or violence, but by story, which is what you're going to learn about tonight, empathetic imagination. How could you get people like me in New York to have empathetic imagination for farm workers in California, and to take community action? And so I became, along with millions, part of the community of farm workers, even though I wasn't one of them. In the class that you have had, you saw how Seth Godin implored you to become leaders, and how the internet enables new tribes who care to come together. So how you use social media is going to be important in terms of community development. You also were exposed to John Fitzgerald Kennedy in the Moral Imperative for Civil Rights, which you heard his speech. You were exposed to Robert Kennedy, in which he created empathetic connection for the assassination of Martin Luther King. And you remember what he said: if you're black, you have every right to feel hatred towards white people, because Martin Luther King was killed by a white man, but somebody in my family was killed by a white man. And immediately he connected the assassination of his brother, John Kennedy, with the assassination of Martin Luther King, thereby, with empathy, created a bond with the people in the streets of Indianapolis. And he gave them a choice. You can either hate, or you can follow Martin Luther King's plea for compassion. You saw Chimamanda Adichie and the power of a story, an African woman who was able to reach out to the world and talk about the power of a story and how you counter stereotypes. You saw Bruno Tortura from Brazil in the power of the smartphone to become broadcasters of events, and that you indeed, if you have events, you're able to use your own media to become broadcasters. So it's the intent and spirit of this workshop. We are here to teach you how to approach creating a narrative, conciliation with people different than you, community organizing, communication, and techniques and empowerment to action. Everything leads to action. You have a great opportunity in that San Francisco State is your community. The administration and faculty are in sympathy and support for you. And you can make this campus a campus of social justice. So leadership is yours for the taking. We hope there will be real actions that encourage you to, from this workshop, that encourage you to use it and make a difference, whether you make a difference here at San Francisco State or when you move on.